Today we are talking about privacy readiness and starting local and going global. Many folks watching this will be from New Zealand, hopefully a few more from abroad as well, but we're primarily talking to Kiwi-based audiences about privacy, what that means for us domestically, and a little bit about what that means for us globally as well. We're a global country in terms of we tend to reach out and do business in all places around the world. So we're talking about getting started with privacy, talking about building a good foundation, particularly as a small business, what that means for you, some of the things you can start doing right now, and how to understand privacy as you scale and grow in your world, and then potentially as you sort of look offshore as well. So joined with me today is Daimhin Warner from Simply Privacy. Welcome, Daimhin.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. Great to have you here. Look, Daimhin is the principal and director at Simply Privacy, a consultancy that offers a full privacy solutions to business and government. And Daimhin is a master's degree in law, public law, and has specialized his career in the area of privacy law and regulations. So welcome. Great to have you on board.
Thank you. Great to be here, and kia ora koutou. Good to get in front of a new audience.
Very cool. Well, this is actually, folks, this is the first one we've done quite like this, a live event. So for welcome, we're going to be doing these every week from now on, from this point forward. So join in same time, same place. We're going to be going live with a series of different topics and guests. First up, we're talking about privacy. Privacy is really relevant to everyone, especially in this day and age, depending on if you're large or small. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Phil. I am founder and CEO of Onwardly. We help startups and small businesses build, manage, and scale their security programs. So Onwardly was started a couple of years ago, and we're really helping make security and now privacy accessible to as many people as possible. So great to have you listening in. And today we're going to talk about different aspects of privacy. What exactly is privacy? When we talk about privacy a lot, it's a topic frequently talked about with the big sort of tech companies and all around the country. But what actually is privacy? We talk about PII and things like that. Would you mind sort of helping us understand, a little bit more what it actually is and how we should think about it?
Yeah, sure. So, it's an important initial consideration because privacy is a very broad term. It's pretty gray. It's pretty waffly. And so I think getting your head around what privacy is as against things like security is really important. And I think the first thing to note is that privacy is a human right. So the right to privacy is enshrined in international human rights laws since the 50s. And fundamentally, it's about ensuring that individuals, people like you and me, have some control over the information that relates to us, that's collected about us, and that's generated about us. And that control really gives us some autonomy, some agency in our own lives, some ability to understand where our data is going and where it's moving. So that's what privacy at a high level is about. And many people talk about privacy being the foundation of trust. And I think that's probably the best way to think about it. For any business that's collecting using personal information, that needs personal information to deliver its services and products, or to develop its services and products, it needs to have that foundation of trust before it can start doing that. And getting privacy right is about building that foundation of trust. But the other thing I would note is that privacy is not the same as security in a very fundamental way. And that is that privacy is not the same as confidentiality or secrecy. What it really is it's a balancing act or an exchange of values between a business and its customers, where the customer understands what's going to happen with their data, is confident about how it's going to be used, and gives that data over willingly in exchange for a service or a product. And so the Privacy Act in New Zealand and privacy laws all around the world take this risk-based approach. They recognize that data is vital. It's vital to the economy. It's the blood of most businesses. And they recognize that data needs to be used and shared, but they just require that collection, use, and sharing is legitimate and reasonable.
Yes. And when we think about privacy, we often think of, about things like Facebook and things about digital products and services that collect information. But it's not just digital, is it? It's all information. Can you talk a little bit more about what constitutes private information and what forms that takes?
Yeah, sure. So, we've got a definition in the Privacy Act in New Zealand, and it's almost identical to the definitions of personal information in all privacy laws around the world. And that is that personal information is information about an identifiable individual. So there's a few components to that we need to sort of tease out to understand it a bit better. Firstly, individual means a natural person, not a business. So when we say natural person, I don't mean someone who enjoys yoga and is a vegan. What I mean is a real living human rather than a corporate entity or a business.
Yes.
So if information relates to a real living human, then the Privacy Act and all other privacy laws cover it.
So
The second thing, not commercial.
It's all about personal information.
It's all about personal. So it doesn't cover things like, corporate policies and even corporate financial reports and all that kind of thing. They may be confidential, but they're not personal information. And so I suppose we'll talk a bit about security later, but that's where security is a bit different, because security tends to apply to all the data that an organization holds, whereas the privacy laws apply only to the personal information that the organization holds. Right. So there's a bit of a difference. The other element to that definition I talked about, so just to remind you again, it's information about an identifiable individual, is that word identifiable. And this is really important because too often I think organizations limit what they understand personal information to be. And they may think it's just your name, your address, your mobile number, your email address. But in fact, personal information is all information that relates to someone who could be identified from that information, even if that doesn't include a name, or even if it doesn't include a date of birth. And, so as an example, you might see a document that contains facts that could only be about, even though Phil's name's not on it, it's about a guy who lives in Auckland who runs a company called Onwardly, has 2 kids, and so by piecing that together, you can determine that that's about Phil. And
so even if they don't include my name or a specific personal detail, just by matter of process of elimination, it has to be me.
That's right. That's right. And so again, we can start to see now as we unpick the definition that it's so much broader than you might think. And the other quick thing to note is that the format is not relevant. So personal information could be a phone recording, it could be a CCTV image, it could be an email, it could be metadata in a database, it could even be the journey I take through a website that's built off cookies in my system. It can be my preferences, it can be my health information, it could be all sorts of things, and it doesn't matter what format that takes. If it's about an individual, then it's personal information. So, there's probably people listening to this today, watching this, who are starting to head explode here when they realize that, in fact, they didn't really anticipate that sort of 95% of the data they hold is potentially personal information about someone. And even if an organization doesn't have a direct to customer relationship, it will still be collecting and holding and using personal information about its employees, also covered by privacy laws. So it's huge.
I remember
the scope is huge.
It is huge. I remember there was a data breach. I say data because I'm half American at this point, but there was a data breach by one of the search giants. I think it might have been Yahoo quite a few years ago, and a series of search queries, the history of some search queries were breached and made open to the public, and people were sort of looking through them, and even though they didn't have people's names in them, you could deduce quite an accurate story about somebody's sort of whereabouts and personal situation just by seeing what they were searching for, and so the argument back then was, well, we didn't identify anyone. It was like, well, you did, because it was quite easy to deduce actually who these people were, and in some cases they were actually identified, and then as a result of just some simple search queries. So there's a lot of information that we're inputting and being collected that may not necessarily look like it's on the surface level like it's PII, but by under your definition it actually is.
That's right. I mean, there's other really interesting breaches that really show that. I mean, there was a breach many years ago now where a data set from IMDb was released, and researchers were able to crunch that data to the point where they could identify individuals and identify their preferences on streaming sites like Netflix. And if you imagine, for example, an individual might be located somewhere like Saudi Arabia, and their preference is for films about the LGBT community, then we've got serious harm potentially coming from a data set that on its face looked de-identified and totally innocuous.
Yes, indeed, indeed. Yeah, interesting. I'm a New Zealand business. We're covered by the New Zealand Privacy Act. Tell me what that kind of means for me. What are my basic obligations?
Sure. So in New Zealand, we've had a Privacy Act since 1993, so it's old now, but it was sort of, I would say, I want to say drastically revised, but it was sort of semi-drastically revised in 2020. And so now we've got a new Privacy Act 2020, which is a little bit more similar to overseas privacy laws, but not quite. And so the way the Privacy Act in New Zealand works is that it's based essentially around 13 privacy principles. And these principles cover the data lifecycle for any organization, from collection through to retention, security, use, disclosure. And so any organization in New Zealand, any agency is subject to the Privacy Act. There's a few very small exceptions. Examples include news media are exempted from the Privacy Act in relation to their news activities. Courts are exempt. But other than that, most agencies and even sole trader individuals who collect personal information about other people are covered by the Privacy Act. And one of the things that the Privacy Act does, which might be interesting to startups, particularly if they're offering software as a service to other countries, is that it makes a distinction between what we term in European terms data processors and data controllers. And so under the Privacy Act in New Zealand, if you're processing personal information solely on behalf of some other agency, so you're a customer, then that customer is subject to the principles and you're not, because you're not holding the information, you're holding it on behalf of somebody else. And so there's all these little nuances that are reflected in New Zealand privacy law and overseas privacy laws that mean you need to think quite carefully about how the law applies to the business that you're doing. The Privacy Act in New Zealand is not that onerous in some ways. We've got new mandatory privacy breach notification requirements.
Yes.
We've got a few other changes to the principles, but we don't have the same kind of drastic fining regimes that we see in other countries like Europe. So the consequences of getting it wrong in New Zealand are slightly lower, but I would argue it doesn't really matter, because really the key consequence that you want to avoid is the reputational and brand damage, the impact on that trust that we talked about before.
Yes, indeed, indeed. So we've got New Zealand Privacy Act that's just recently been updated. We've also got overseas privacy laws or frameworks, well-known ones such as GDPR. We've got CCPA, which I think is in the process of being renamed in America. We've got one across the ditch, the Australian version of Privacy Act, and probably several others, no doubt, around the world. It's quite typical for Kiwi businesses in particular to look to sell off overseas, and especially if you're in a startup space and you're in software, there's really no geographical boundaries. You can sell your product anywhere in the world. How should people be thinking about those not just our own version of the Privacy Act, but other global privacy frameworks, and thinking about how to adopt the right principles for those?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right, Phil. There's privacy laws popping up all over the world. It's like it's the new fashion to have a privacy law. And in fact, someone said that soon 50% of people around the world will be protected by some sort of privacy law. So that's quite significant. Now, the other issue for agencies in New Zealand is that most privacy laws overseas have what we call extraterritorial effect. And so this means that even if you're based in New Zealand, if you are collecting personal information about people in another country, then you will be subject to their laws. And that's what extraterritorial effect means. Our Privacy Act does it too, by the way, but that doesn't matter because we're already subject to it here. And so what you'll then find is that if you do something wrong with data, regulators overseas may pick that up. They may receive complaints from customers overseas, and they may investigate an organization here in New Zealand. So it sounds really frightening. And we've got, as you mentioned, GDPR, CCPA. We've got a new personal information protection law in China. We've got Brazil, India, Thailand. Privacy laws are popping up everywhere. And, the APAC region particularly has a very strong history of privacy regulation. Now, the good thing is that for the most part, all privacy laws around the world are based on the same fundamental foundational privacy principles that I mentioned before. These principles came from what we call the OECD, which is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD.
Yes.
They developed in the 1980s, they developed the Fair Information Principles. And so these principles are what underpin all privacy laws, including our own. And they include data minimization, use limitation, transparency or openness, individual participation. So that's, my right to request a copy of the information you hold about me. Security, of course, and quite importantly, accountability. This is a big part of privacy laws, and this is the idea that the organization is accountable for the information that it holds, but also is accountable for sharing that information across borders to other countries. And so accountability is a really big part of the picture. And so because most of those principles have already fed into New Zealand's Privacy Act, if a business in New Zealand is sort of, is careful to comply with New Zealand's Privacy Act, it's likely, though not certain, but likely that they'll already be complying with overseas privacy laws.
Okay.
All of that said, there are some fundamental differences in some laws, and I'll use GDPR as an example because a lot of New Zealand businesses like to sell to Europe. GDPR contains some specific rights and obligations that we don't have here. As an example, there's the right to be forgotten, which a lot of people talk about. This is the idea that an individual customer can demand that you delete their information. That's not a right that we have here in New Zealand. And so if you're selling to Europe, you may need to think about managing that issue.
How you handle those requests, yeah.
How do you handle those requests? Because also it's not an absolute right. You don't actually have a right to delete. You've got a right to delete if the agency has no lawful purpose to use the information anymore. So it's actually quite limited. There's also a right to data portability in many laws. So that's the idea that if you have data in a machine readable format, which most organizations today do, and particularly tech, so Facebook as an example, then I have the right to ask you to take all of that data in a machine readable format and give it to your competitor. And so the data portability right is really huge, and it's all about pro-competition and sort of anti-monopoly. So it's saying, no one agency should hold all the data and then sort of exclude you from going anywhere else because your history is with them.
Around it and prevent you.
Exactly.
You moving around.
So data portability is a big one, and it's coming in New Zealand too. We've got a consumer data right, which is being passed shortly. And then the other thing to think about is that overseas laws are doing a lot more than New Zealand to deal with what we call automated decision making. And this is huge for many tech companies, particularly if they start building software that helps their customers make automated decisions. So by that, I mean, you don't make a decision, you have an algorithm that crunches all the data about your customers and it pops out a decision for you. And so there's a real concern among privacy regulators that is very opaque and very difficult for people to understand, and that we all have a right to be decided upon by a human. And so a lot of privacy laws overseas give people the right not to be subjected to this automated decision making. So that's something we're going to see coming here in New Zealand. But if you're building tech for overseas markets, it's definitely something you'll need to think about.
Do we see a little bit of that already in advertising? So sometimes, or automatic, not necessarily advertising, but algorithms. So something like you're watching Netflix and they're saying, we're suggesting these things to you because based on your activity here or based on your preference. And there's a movement to make some of that a little bit more understandable, other than just kind of this magic black box of decision making.
That's sorry, Phil. That's a really good example that you've given, because automated decision making, essentially profiling is a big form of that. And of course, we don't realize that, but we see it literally everywhere. And Spotify sending you suggestions for things you might like, that is profiling, and that's based on machine learning. And so these things happen all the time on technology. Now, it's really important, I think, to make a distinction between automated decision making that doesn't impact on someone's rights, in other words, doesn't sort of create adverse outcomes for people, and automated decision making that does. So the stuff around profiling is kind of okay because it's not going to change someone's life for the worse. But there have been organizations have been penalized for making really important decisions based on algorithms. And in fact, here in New Zealand, EC was penalized for using technology to make decisions on claims that were opaque. And those obviously have a really big impact on consumers, on individuals, whereas some other profiling activities less of an impact. So you do need to, when I talk about this risk-based approach, you need to differentiate what's the risk here and manage it accordingly. Yeah,
indeed, and there's an ethical component to some of those
absolutely
algorithms as well, isn't there? Which is a good sort of lead in actually to the next thing I was going to ask you about is how does Where does ethics play a part in privacy? Obviously, the two are closely aligned, and you mentioned to me, I think we were talking yesterday, and I wanted to sort of bring it up here for our listeners, is that, just because you can collect information doesn't mean you should. Even if people give you permission to it. Do you mind just talking a little bit about that as we sort of come to the final part of our conversation about how consent isn't enough when it comes to
sure. Okay, yeah, no, that's a really good point about ethics, and I'm glad we're getting to talk about it. So obviously, as I've said, privacy laws have been around for decades, and they've been based on quite flexible principles all around the world. Now, while the laws are getting a wee bit more prescriptive and a bit more serious, they are still very permissive. And so this means that, in fact, most businesses can do an alarming amount of things with data and still be on the right side of the law. But if we look at privacy less as being a compliance obligation and more being a foundation of trust, then we realize that complying with the law is not enough. We need to comply with the expectations of the people that we're dealing with. And I think that's where ethics comes in. It's the idea of saying, well, this might be lawful, but could this cause harm to people? Could it run counter to their expectations of what we're going to do? Could it damage our trust? And so I think that most organizations that have kind of mature privacy frameworks in place or approaches are looking beyond the law and saying, how does this data use align with our values as an organization? How does it align with our customer expectations? Do we have a social license to do this thing with data? And I guess the big question for me, and probably the big overriding question, is, are we doing harm or are we doing good? Which sounds very waffly, and one of the issues we have with ethics is that it's subjective. The law is relatively objective, but ethics are subjective. Whose ethics are we talking about here? Is it yours? Is it mine? Is it our customer? We may all have different ethical boundaries, and so there's a lot of difficulty in applying an ethics approach. So you've got to sort of do your best, because I think a lot of unethical behavior is blatantly obvious, and then there's maybe some at the edges where it might take a little bit more thought. But I think overall, if you're aiming to do no harm, then you're probably in a good spot in terms of that ethical question.
Yeah. So as a business, you might, one practical thing you can do in that arena is to ask, is to go through that exercise every time you look at collecting information or doing something with somebody's private information. Does this have the potential to cause harm? Do we need this information? Going through that, asking themselves those sorts of questions, correct?
Absolutely.
What other couple of practical takeaways, Devin, we could leave folks with? If you're a small business, small startup looking to kind of try and get your arms around privacy, perhaps starting with New Zealand, maybe thinking abroad. What are some practical things, 2 or 3 things people could sort of do starting now?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I guess the most fundamental thing, well, no, firstly, don't be afraid of privacy. It's all going to be okay. That was one thing I would definitely say.
It's all going to be okay.
And even if you've got a global footprint, as I've said, most privacy laws are similar, and so it's not as bad as it looks. But the most fundamental thing I think any agency can do to start with is know its data. So you can't assess your privacy risk or take an ethical view or make sure you're compliant if you don't know what personal information you hold. So that's step one. You need to map your data. You need to work out where your personal information is, who you're collecting it from, what you're doing with it, where you hold it, why you need it, who has access to it, all those things. And then you get a really clear picture. Oh, we're collecting way too much data here, or we're looking good, but now we've got a nice documented plan. And then I guess the other quick, easy thing to do, which many small agencies particularly fail to do or forget to do, is get your governance settings right. And so making sure you've got a privacy officer is number one. And in fact, it's a legal obligation. The Privacy Act requires every agency to have a privacy officer or a data protection officer, as it's termed in Europe. And so that's your second step, is have someone in your organization who's actually accountable and cares about privacy. And it could be an existing person. It could be someone that you've hired in, especially, but it doesn't have to be. You can even outsource it, which sounds a bit like a plug for my business, but you can. The Privacy Act specifically permits you to outsource your privacy officer functions. But that is a critical step, is to have that governance in place. Yeah. So those are probably the 2 first things. And then there's other things that fall off that in terms of policy and procedure. But knowing your data and having governance around it are really your key first steps to starting that pathway to being ready to comply.
That's great. That's great. No one's too small to have a privacy officer. You can nominate that role, I assume, just in any business, even if you're, one person, obviously it's got to be one person, but it's usually good as well to have that person be, someone that can have a meaningful conversation with someone else who's perhaps collecting the information on them more readily. So think about who that might be, and the best person in the business. Maybe typically we'll find they're often someone sort of in HR or finance, typically, not exclusively, but that's a common pattern we see.
That's right. And it's funny, we often see it in HR, and I sometimes think it's because HR professionals tend to be kinder. They understand humans. And so often it's a nice fit for a privacy officer to be in that area, as long as they're capable of looking beyond employee information. That's the only thing I would caution is wherever you put it, make sure that they've got some understanding of customer and employee information. They're appropriately senior, but also have the capacity to get the job done. It's a funny mix, this role.
Yes.
But yeah, and look, what works. Yeah.
Indeed, and they'll often, they can have an engaging conversation with a product owner or an engineering director about where that information is going and how much is being stored and things like that. One thing that we hear quite commonly, what are the consequences if we get privacy wrong? We've talked a little bit about reputational damage, fining, things like that. What does that mean if we make mistakes?
Yeah, so it's a bit different in New Zealand as against other countries. So in New Zealand, we don't have punitive fines. So that means the Privacy Commissioner can't hit you with a big fine for getting it wrong. Right. What will normally happen here is that an individual who finds out that something's gone wrong will complain to the Privacy Commissioner, and the Privacy Commissioner will investigate and try and sort of resolve it. The Privacy Commissioner can issue compliance notices to say, stop doing something or do something to fix this issue. And that's probably as bad as it's going to get. There is the risk that something could go to the Human Rights Review Tribunal, and the tribunal could issue compensation to an individual. So that could be in the tens of thousands of dollars, but it's nowhere near the millions of dollars that we see overseas. To me, the biggest, and look, we've already talked about it, the biggest impact, the biggest consequence is that trust issue, partly because the media in New Zealand really loves a privacy breach. And so you can guarantee that if something goes wrong, the media will get hold of it, and they will be ruthless when they report about it. And we've seen it here over the last few years with Reserve Bank of New Zealand, Waikato DHB, even the use of facial recognition by Bunnings in Australia. The media just loves a juicy privacy story, and that is not a fair court to be heard in. So it's not worth it, in my view, even if we don't have huge fines here in New Zealand. But then, of course, you've also got the other side of the coin, which is if you're operating overseas, you could be hit by incredibly hefty fines of up to 20 million euros or 4% of your global annual turnover, which is potentially huge. And so there is that risk as well.
Okay. Is privacy dead? There's this, I know it's a silly question, there's this got a saying online, is your privacy dead? The internet knows so much about us. We're kind of slaves to social media. They know more than us when we realize, what's the point? So goes the thinking. Why does privacy still matter? Even if we're willingly, sometimes people say, well, I've got nothing to hide. You can deduce whatever you like about me. Why does it still matter? What's the counter argument to that?
Yeah, and you can totally see why people have said this. It is a famous, I think it was the CEO of some big tech corporation in the late 90s or early noughties, I think, who said, privacy's dead, get over it. And it was all during this big rise of big tech, rise of big data, and the rise of social media. And so you can sort of understand where he was coming from, because it appeared that individuals, consumers, put much more value in interacting online than they did in privacy. In other words, they didn't seem to want to keep anything secret. But I can totally challenge that. I would say privacy is more alive than ever, but you just have to view it a bit differently. So, back in the 90s, when we didn't have big tech or internet 2.0 and web, all this different kind of iterations of data sharing and big data gathering, back then, privacy was much more about secrecy and confidentiality. We had documents and files sitting in filing cabinets with keys. Today, though, privacy has evolved, and it has to evolve into, because if we come back to what I started with earlier on, privacy is about autonomy, it's about control. And so privacy has to evolve with the way that we interact today. And so privacy is as real as it ever was, but it means it's something different. It means we have to respect the wishes of an individual. If an individual wants to share this online, it doesn't necessarily mean they want to share that online. And it's about making sure that we have a social license to do what people expect us to do with data. So people care just as much about privacy, but they just set their boundaries a little bit differently.
Indeed. It's just not an open check to do anything you like with people's data just because they've given it to you, or you can get it in the first place.
And of course, since that phrase was put out there, we had, a really a doozy of an example, which was Facebook selling data to Cambridge Analytica. And so, yeah, sure, I was happy to share my data with Facebook so I could talk to my friends and get some decent advertising. But I wasn't remotely happy with Cambridge Analytica scraping my data so that they could manipulate the way I voted in an election. And so, people still have clear boundaries, and privacy is as important as ever to protect those.
Yeah, absolutely, and that extends all the way up to surveillance on a national level, and we have a right not to have that happen. I've seen some coverage on that, of course, in recent years as well.
And can I also just say, you mentioned before, if you've got nothing to hide, why does privacy matter? And I think it's really important to shake that idea, because, and I know it wasn't you weren't saying it from the heart, but we have a right to have something to hide, and there's nothing wrong with being closed about your life. You just have to think about, things like being on that gender identity pathway, or, changing your sexuality, or coming out as one sexuality or another. These are all things that are inherently personal to us, and we have a right to hide them until we're ready to share them. And so I think there's an idea that privacy is only for criminals and pedophiles, when in fact it's not. It's for everyone. We all have the right to private life.
It should be the default, right? It should be the default, not the exception to the rule. And so
that's it.
Default to be private. And if you want to share or want to give your information to someone, you can, but it's not for someone else to take or to expose.
That's it exactly.
Really, really important. Really important. Hey, look, I think we have covered a lot of ground today. It's been really, really fascinating. Thank you, Daimhin, for your insights on this. I think privacy can sometimes be a little hard to understand and wrap our arms around, and you've been able to kind of make that way more accessible for us to think about. So I really appreciate your time here today and sharing all your knowledge with us. It's been really great.
You're welcome. It's been really fun.
Appreciate that. We appreciate your time, Daimhin. It's been great, and we'll see you all next week, everybody.
You're welcome. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Phil.